Welcome to Behind the Badge, the show where we delve into some of the most pressing issues facing our society and law enforcement today. I'm your host, Joe Vargas, and today we have a very special episode lined up for you. We are honored to be joined by Happy Medina, a former human trafficking investigator who has spent years on the front lines fighting one of the most heinous crimes imaginable. Human trafficking in the United States is a significant and multifaceted issue. It is estimated that hundreds of thousands of people are trafficked within the U.S. annually. However, the exact numbers are challenging to ascertain due to the hidden nature of the crime. In this episode, we will be uncovering the myths and realities of human trafficking, exploring the true extent of the problem, and discussing the profound impact it has on its victims. Our guest brings a wealth of first-hand experience and insights that are crucial to understanding this complex issue. So, sit back, listen, and prepare to be informed and moved by the stories and expertise shared in this critical conversation. Okay, as we said in my introduction here, this is now retired investigator Happy Medina, 8 years with the Orange County Human Trafficking Task Force, working specifically with victims and suspects of human trafficking. You were there right pretty much at the beginning when this organization was formed, and you've got a wealth of experience, and glad to say that you're now going around and providing training now to agencies all over the state regarding human trafficking and its issues, but also how to investigate and prosecute these particular cases. How did you get involved in human trafficking? Of all the details in the police department that one could get, this is almost right up there with who would want to be a child abuse investigator?
Well, I've been there and done that. I did work sexual assaults for 2.5 years, and I think that was in some ways providential to where I ended up in human trafficking. So the short story on how I became a part of the Human Trafficking Task Force was I had already been in Anaheim PD for about 21 years, and it wasn't a storybook career, but I got most of the things that I put in for, and looking back, I have no regrets. My department was fantastic to work for, and all in all, I had a very amazing career. I got to do so many amazing things. So when I hit 21 years, I'm thinking, well, I'm not a young man anymore. I started late. I started when I was 32. So when I entered into human trafficking, I was already over 50. Most of my peers and colleagues were retiring and going on and doing other things, enjoying life, but I was still in the middle of it. And there was a memo put out that there was a vacancy in the task force for a human trafficking investigator. I'll be honest with you, I didn't know what human trafficking was. I knew what prostitution was because from the very beginning of my career, I was assigned to an area in Anaheim where prostitutes gathered, where they were soliciting their services, and I would honestly just pull over and talk to them and try to educate myself, and they were generally always very forthcoming about what they did and how they conducted their business. So I was introduced to it early, and then throughout my career, we would help out other details like our vice detail when they would do undercover operations, either focused on sex purchasers or prostitutes, girls working. And that's about all I knew. But at that point in my career, I was thinking, how do I want to end my career? I was in the last third of my career, and I really wanted to do something that I felt that I could be passionate about. Still not knowing that much about human trafficking, I met with the then supervisor, and we had a very good discussion about it. But and when I put my name in the hat, to be honest with you, I didn't think he was going to pick me. I probably wouldn't have picked me, but again, Providence has its way, and he selected me. And what I found out is once I got into investigating these crimes and seeing the commonality between girls that are working as prostitutes and even back when I worked sex crimes, how vulnerable they were and how they were being exploited, my eyes were open to a whole new criminal element that I'd never known, which became the pimping and pandering subculture in the world of trafficking. So that's when my education began. And I was mentored by a couple DAs at the Orange County District Attorney's Office who were phenomenal. My supervisor, even though he was new to it, he had a lot of experience in investigations. And before I knew it, I was just caught up in this world, and I found my passion. And my goal initially was, I'll do this for 2 or 3 years, and then maybe I'll try to promote and then retire and go off into the sunset. But that's not how it played out. So 8 years later, I retired out of that detail, and I just knew before I retired that I was going to continue to provide training, and just pretty much the same training that I had been part of for those 8 years, but now I was going to, it was on my own, and I could kind of do it my way. So that's how I got started. But I had no idea what I was getting into, but it's been an amazing journey.
For our listeners, can you explain a little bit about what the Orange County Human Trafficking Task Force is? You were working for Anaheim PD, but you were part of something bigger.
Yes, and that's that's a great question. It's something that's going to come up again, I think, in the interview. I think the Orange County Human Trafficking Task Force is made up of several different entities. We call it a collaborative model, and it's been extremely successful. My representation was just the law enforcement portion. So at that time and throughout the 8 years, we've had anywhere from 5 or 6 investigators and 1 sergeant to 11 investigators and 2 sergeants, because it's kind of cyclical. That's just how things go. But I represent the law enforcement portion. In that collaborative model, we have social services, we have the judicial court system, we have the Orange County District Attorney's Office, we have victim advocates. Waymakers is a huge part of the collaborative model. We have faith-based groups. And what I've learned from that is that it really is a village. We really address this in a very collaborative way. We all recognize that we have something I often refer to that everybody has something to bring to the party, and all of those things are essential if you want to really address the issue of human trafficking in a very proper or effective manner. So it's bigger than us. It's bigger than Anaheim PD. There's other agencies. Like currently right now you have Santa Ana PD, Irvine PD, California Highway Patrol, who are part of our task force. And we've learned that the secret to the success is to stay mission focused. Everybody kind of respects each other for their expertise and what they bring, because our mission is really to serve our victims, to identify our victims. And on the law enforcement side, our biggest responsibility is identifying victims, but then going after those who are exploiting them, the traffickers or the pimps. And
this particular model really has become the standard around at least the state of California, if not the country.
Absolutely. From the first year that I was in the unit, my sergeant told me that one of the reasons he selected me because he knew I loved to train, and I quickly became part of the training. At that time it was a one-day training. But I got to travel with, basically the training consisted of a prosecutor, law enforcement representative, social services, victim advocacy, and oftentimes we bring a survivor. So it was a very well thought out presentation and training, but it was only 8 hours. And we would go all through the state, and you're absolutely correct. After doing this for almost 10 years, the collaborative model has been tried to be duplicated throughout the state, and we have several different parts of those entities that get invited by other agencies to say, how are you doing this? We want to model our task force, or we want to do this correctly. And we've had great opportunities, and law enforcement and all the entities have been super receptive to being aware and educated and trained on human trafficking for the most part.
Okay, let's get into the crux of what human trafficking is and isn't. I mean, I think a lot of people's perception are based on media perceptions of what human trafficking is, and it always comes up to Liam Neeson, running after his kidnapped daughter and, taking out all the bad guys type of thing. But I mean, in my own law enforcement experience, the model, I mean, what human trafficking was very different from what people's perception was.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I said, my perception was skewed, and my perception was also dictated largely in part by the media and movies. So let me give you an example. Well, you already used Taken, and I use that in my training because to the most common average person, they think of human trafficking as training. Now, I will say that there are definitely elements that are correct in that movie, but they're discussing more, and that movie's based on like international type, what we think of someone being kidnapped or someone visiting a foreign country and then being exploited into working as a prostitute. Those things occur. My first introduction, and you'll remember this, some of your listeners may not, they may be too young, but my first introduction to human trafficking in the media was the movie Pretty Woman. Mm-hmm. And that movie was initially, what I understand, was supposed to be a movie created to dissuade people and to explain the problems associated with becoming a prostitute. But apparently that got all flipped. It turned into a romantic comedy. By the way, I think my memory serves me correct, it's like the 5th highest grossing movie that's ever been done, and it's basically about a girl, Julia Roberts. She's an escort, which is just a fancy word for a girl working as a prostitute, who happens to meet a billionaire, and they live there happily ever after. And it's just a funny side note. I don't think it's funny, actually, but the company that produced and directed and put that movie out was Disney, which we think of basically as a family-friendly corporation. But in this case, I would have a different opinion. So you're right, the media does contribute to that. So now let's talk about what it is and what it isn't. So there's a couple things that I want to share with you. One thing is that, without getting too much into the weeds or definitions, one of the common conceptions I hear, not just among law enforcement, but just in the general public, is that the confusion between smuggling and trafficking. There's a delineation between the two. So let me just go over it because it's not difficult to grasp. Smuggling, there's 3 components to that. Smuggling is a crime against a border or a country. Smuggling often involves a voluntary movement of someone, okay? And it often involves movement of a person. Trafficking is completely different. Trafficking is a crime against a person. It's exploitation based. Oftentimes trafficking occurs, the victims are vulnerable and they are not willing participants. They don't seek to be exploited, but they find themselves being exploited. And the other caveat I think that's most important is victims of trafficking don't need to be moved. They don't need to be brought across a border. Of course, that happens, or they were taken across the state line or from city to city, but it doesn't require movement. And maybe later we'll talk about this concept of deprivation of liberty. Because really, when you talk about human trafficking, the thing that sets it apart and that defines it, especially as the law is concerned, is this phrase, deprivation of liberty. And it can be quite confusing at first, because at first blush, when you see a girl working out as a prostitute, so let me give you an example. I can take you right now, like if we were to get into a car, I can take you to areas right now within the county of Orange and especially LA County, and I can drive to a location, to a track. A track is a geographical location where prostitutes gather to solicit their services. I can drive you there right now, and I can show you crime occurring right in front of us, girls working as prostitutes, okay? And every one of those girls out there has a cell phone, and every one of those cell phones has 911. And the question that the general public and even officers ask me are, why aren't they calling for help? That answer is very profound, and maybe we'll get a chance to talk about it a little bit, but it's very profound. And when the truth is revealed about that, I think people start to understand that the misconception that these girls are out there, they enjoy what they're doing, they're out there of their own free will, they choose to do this, and why should we care? Why should we see them anything other than a suspect?
One of the myths, and again, going back to the movie Taken and stuff, is that traffickers, purposely addict their girls to drugs, and in my experience, that was never the case because the drugs had more influence than they did.
Yeah, absolutely. Another great insight. So we do talk about some of the myths in the training, and that's one that comes up. So this is the way I describe it when we do our training, or just in general. So 28 years ago when I started in law enforcement, I will say that there was some validity to a pimp, and when he would control his girls first of all, by force. But the other things, there were addictions involved, whether it be methamphetamine or heroin or whatever the drug of the day was, cocaine. As time went on, as just like any criminal element advances and becomes more technical, or as they fine tune it, a trafficker now, when he puts his girls out on the track, he wants them looking at their best. He wants them looking healthy. He wants them to be attractive. He wants them to draw the sex purchasers to them. Now, if anybody that's ever seen or come across, or in our profession that has seen a male or a female that is addicted to drugs, they don't look healthy, and they don't look attractive, and they have serious issues going on. So the way I describe it is like if you were going to buy a new car and you were going to sell your car that's 20 years old, the first thing you would do is go out and detail it, make it look as nice as it could before you put it on the market. We have to think along those lines that the traffickers nowadays, they avoid any drugs, any serious drugs. The most common addictions are that both trafficker and their victims use is marijuana, it's weed, or alcohol, but not to the point of addiction. Just enough to keep them pacified, just enough because that's their particular addiction. But think about it. It's difficult, and it would be difficult enough to, if I was a trafficker and I had 4 or 5 girls working in my stable and they were all addicted to some kind of serious drug, how difficult would that be to control them and to monitor their behavior? I'd rather have them healthy and looking good, feeling good about themselves, so when they go out there, they're attracting the sex purchaser, because as a trafficker, all I care about is $1 and how much they make. So
let's get into the victim, or the person who is being trafficked. Give me an idea, what is the stereotypical model of somebody who is being trafficked?
Well, let's deal with that as another myth. I want to approach that as a myth. First of all, anyone can be trafficked. Okay. Now you're gonna hear through the course of our discussion here me refer to most victims as females. So I just want to say, for those listening, I recognize that there's all shapes and sizes, all genders that are being trafficked. But I can tell you that in the 8 years of my experience working investigations, all of my victims were female. I had one transgender, and I never had a male. So just so your audience knows that if I keep referring them to female, just so that they know I recognize they come in all shapes and sizes. So the stereotypical is sometimes perpetrated by demographics. And so we live here in Southern California, and I'm going to tell you right now as a disclaimer, my expertise, my knowledge, the only reason you should be listening to me is in regards to the state of California and to Orange County, LA County, Northern California. I'm pretty familiar with what happens throughout the state, but every county is different. For example, Orange County, we don't have what I refer to as homegrown pimps or homegrown prostitutes, okay? I know that I had one case of a Irvine trafficker that came out of Irvine. I don't know of any others, to be honest with you, within the task force during my tenure there, that we had someone from Orange County that grew up in Orange County in a culture that perpetrated, or where that was a cultural norm. LA County, 100% different. You have girls coming out of generations of prostitution where that's the norm. Becoming a prostitute is not out of their norm. You have primarily men that have been grown up with uncles and grandfathers or fathers that were pimps. So it's cyclical, just kind of like domestic violence. It's a cycle that needs to be broken. But as far as stereotype goes, I want to make it clear, and this is super important, that anyone can be a victim of HT. However, some are more vulnerable to it than others. And I think that's the thing that we want to focus on, is that the vulnerability, when you think about this as a crime of exploitation, traffickers are predators. Okay, when I have an opportunity, and I've had numerous opportunities to testify in a court of law as a so-called expert, and let me just say as a disclaimer, that word gets misused a lot. I don't really think of myself as an expert. I just think of myself as someone, based on my experience and all the people I've talked to, I probably know more than the average person. But I have testified in court numerous times, both at trial and at preliminary hearings. And when the district attorney asked me, Investigator Medina, could you please describe to the court or the jury what does a victim of human trafficking look like? My immediate response is, a victim of human trafficking very much resembles a victim of domestic violence. Because I want the court and the jury, much of the time they're not educated, I want them to have an instant connection, because everybody in that courtroom knows what a victim of domestic violence is. So the comparison that I make is, with the victim of domestic violence, you have predominantly women, in my experience, who are continually abused by a husband or a boyfriend. They're beaten, they're just, they're spoken to in horrific ways, and they endure all of this. And it's the same question, why do you stay with this person? Why are you continuing to subject yourself to abuse? The number one reason that they give is, I love him. And then there's other reasons that follow. But to an ordinary person or someone that hasn't experienced domestic violence, it's hard to imagine how someone that you're talking to, I remember this particular woman that I went to on a domestic violence call, her lip was swelling up, her eye was already black, the fire department had given her ice pack to put on, and I asked her, I said, we can help you, we can get you out of this situation, allow us to help you. And she refused all our help, and she said, I love this man. Where am I going to go? He supports me. So all these reasons, as the folks that are listening to this, if it helps you better understand human trafficking, the mind of a victim of human trafficking, they have suffered so much trauma. They're extremely vulnerable. Almost all of them have been traumatized in childhood. I can tell you that 90% of the girls that I've talked to, and that's conservative, if they will talk to you about their lives, and almost all of them at some point say, can I tell you something, Investigator Medina? And I already know what's coming. She's going to tell me a story about how she was sexually abused, physically abused, or had suffered abuse when she was a child, and that made her extremely vulnerable to traffickers. They're predators. And I describe them as such in a court of law, just like I use that example of domestic violence. When the district attorney says, Investigator Medina, can you please explain to the court or the jury, what does a pimp or trafficker look like? I've answered this, and I will continue to answer this way. I'll say, to me, a trafficker is a child molester. He's a pedophile. And everybody in that courtroom knows what a pedophile is. So really quickly, what I explain to them is, a child molester selects his target. It's a three-prong to make it very academic and easy. He or she selects his target, vulnerable target. The next phase is he or she puts himself in a position of trust. Now, his next goal is to groom and put himself in a position of trust. Once he achieves that position of trust, the final goal is personal and sexual gratification. A trafficker selects his victim, a vulnerable target. He recruits that victim, which is very similar to grooming process, okay? Once he puts himself in a position of trust with that predominantly female, he will move to his final goal, which is to exploit that girl, to sell her like a piece of property 8 to 10 to 12 times a day, 7 days a week, just so he can put money in his pocket. He puts her out in the street, he puts her on the internet, and he sells her like a commodity, like a piece of property, just so he can fill his pockets with money.
One of the things I've read and have noticed is that it seems like a bunch of these victims come from the foster care system.
It's very sad and very unfortunate. I just, in preparing for today's interview, I did, because I'm not much of a stat person, but I would recommend your listeners, if they want to educate themselves more, I can tell them you might want to go to the Polaris site. They're an amazing organization, and I was reviewing some of their sites for 2021, and it's just disheartening that a lot of our girls at a young age, because of the dynamics in their home, many of them do end up in foster care and group homes, and there's statistics that Polaris puts out that shows, I don't know what the percentage is, but there is a high percentage of our kids, mostly minors. And let me pause here and say, the average age of a girl entering into prostitution is 12 to 14 years of age. It's not 18 or 19. Okay, what happens is most of these girls, the youngest girl I ever had was a 13-year-old. They start at a very young age. By the time they're 18 and we see them as an adult, we think, oh, they're an adult, they're doing what they want to do, and we don't know the history that they were groomed, they were recruited at a young age, and this is all they know in life. So they get put into placement, foster care homes, the juvenile system, and they're recruited. They're recruited in these systems. I won't tell you where this occurred. It did occur in Orange County, but this is a true story that was told to me. It was a 16-year-old. I think she was 16-year-old. She was a runaway. She had committed a crime. She'd been taken for placement, and it was in a particular location that was not a lockdown facility. It was more just to care for her. While she was there, she took pictures of several girls that were housed with her. She sent those pictures to her trafficker and basically said, which one of these girls do you want? And he picked 2 or 3 of them. She told these girls, who would like to go to Vegas tonight? And of course, who wouldn't? And all these girls stood up, packed their bags. They literally walked out of the facility. There's nothing, because the state of California at this particular facility doesn't allow you to go hands-on. They walked across the street where the pimp promptly picked them up and began to traffic them. So these stories are true. They really are encouraging. Now, I do want to say that doesn't mean that all group homes and foster care facilities, and there's so many good people that are doing good work in those environments, but it is true. And the bottom line is, it doesn't matter where you're at. These girls are being targeted at every level, whether they're in a school, whether we'll talk about the internet later, wherever a trafficker can reach out and touch them, especially with the advent of the internet and smartphones, everyone is a potential victim.
As we were talking about the 3-pronged things that happen, they meet the victim, they form a relationship with the victim, then they exploit the victim. The term emotional manipulation, it seems to be the tool that they're using.
And I said earlier, like back when I first started, so there's different styles of pimping, and this has also come up in a court of law in testimony. There's 4 basic styles of pimping: guerrilla pimping, Romeo pimping, a CEO pimp, and a boyfriend pimp. Back when I started, the predominant style of trafficking or pimping was the guerrilla pimp. He used force, he used intimidation to motivate his girls, to keep them in line, to keep them what we refer to as in pocket, so that they would go out there and they would make the money that he wanted them to make. As time has passed, in all the 8 years that I was on the task force, the predominant style of pimping right now, and I don't think it's changed because I very much stay up to date with my peers and my colleagues that are still in the task force because I want to stay relevant, is the boyfriend style of pimping is predominant, and it's very successful. You're talking about emotional, right? So think about this, going back to the DV victim, I can't tell you how many of these girls that I've interviewed that are in love with their traffickers. Many of these girls did not have a father figure in their life. There's a reason why pimps expect their girls to call them daddy. That's not an innocuous term that didn't just come out, was invented with no reason. So many of the terms in the pimping and pandering subculture, they have meaning. So when they are referred to as daddy, they are basically inserting themselves into this girl's life as their father figure, which is a positive thing. We're, those of us that are fathers, you think about being a father in a positive way. You nurture someone, you protect them, you take care of them, you provide for them. So the trafficker comes in to many of these girls who are already vulnerable, they're already broken, they have father issues. They come in and they fill this void that the father should have fulfilled, and that person comes along and starts to meet all their emotional needs. They tell them how beautiful they are, they tell them how they've never been with anyone like them. It's called the boyfriend style, the pimp. When you think about it, it's very evil, because what they're doing is they're feigning affection, and they're representing something that outside of the trafficking world, well, every girl wants to have a healthy relationship and a good boyfriend or a good husband. And yet they take that and they twist it and they use it for to manipulate girls. And I think every female listening to this conversation would agree, and obviously I'm not a female, that the emotional and physical connection that occurs even just to sex and intimacy and touching and all that is so intimate and so powerful. And I don't think anyone would disagree with me that love is often talked about as the most strongest force in the world. So once these girls fall in love with their traffickers, then everything else that follows is easy. The manipulation doesn't have to be done by force. It's done through emotional methods. I can't tell you how many times I've read text messages or I've read a communication between a trafficker and a pimp and his girl, and he will commend her for how beautiful she looks and how much money she's making and how proud I am of you, and go on, but it's all feigned. It's just a completely exploitation is what it is. So it's very tragic.
One of the things that becomes very obvious, anybody who's worked with somebody involved in the sex industry, is they seem to be all broken toys.
They are. They're broken, and this isn't my area of expertise. Trauma. I've tried to learn about it. When we go back to the collaborative model, I rely on the victim advocates and the counselors and those people. But they have taught me about trauma bonding. There's terms regarding. I'm trying to learn about the frontal lobe system. The way I've been explained it to me is that, there's 4 parts of our brain. The frontal lobe controls our decision-making process, okay? I think I got the numbers right on this. They might be a little skewed, so forgive me. But I think for a female, the frontal lobe system is completely developed by the age of 21. I think for a male, it's 26. I use that excuse often for all the mistakes I made during that year, those years, or those bad decisions. But anyway, on a serious note, what I understand that the experts and those people who are really study this, the development of our brain, any kind of traumatic injury that occurs, physical, emotional, child abuse, as a child, that can have a severe impact on the development of our frontal lobe system. Now, that's helpful to me as an investigator, and it might be helpful to your audience as you struggle with the why questions. So when I'm talking and I'm interviewing a female, and in my mind, as I'm listening to these horrific stories, when they do cooperate and as we learn the truth about their exploitation, the horrific things that they've been through, in my mind I keep thinking, why? This helps me with the why question, because I kind of look at them and I'm going, you know what, I don't even know if you're capable of making good decisions. Now, that doesn't excuse behavior. One thing I haven't mentioned yet, and I get, this is a complicated issue. Girls that are out on the street working as prostitutes, they're still committing a crime. But to me, they're not criminals. There's a difference. You're committing a crime, and if you get arrested, so be it, okay? But we have to look past that, because oftentimes there's a story that brought them out to that that place, right? Same thing like, and I know you're more of an expert than I am at this, but with the gang culture, you want to be included into this family. You want to be part of something, and therefore you go out and you commit crimes that maybe you might not have committed unless you became part of this group. Now that doesn't excuse the behavior, okay? I want to make that clear, but that gives us a little bit of insight to it, and how you deal with that and what conclusions you come. Everybody has their opinions. So
when you look at this, they're in love with their trafficker,
yes,
or their victimizer. This makes it extremely hard, I would suppose, to prosecute these pimps when you can't get the people that they're trafficking to testify against them.
Well, my experience, and I got to give props to our prosecutors, Orange County District Attorney's Office, our experience has been completely opposite, because those people that were involved at the very beginning of the task force, and when they started to learn about the laws of pimping and pandering, the laws that had been generated in 2012 with Proposition 35, the laws there was the sentencing and the dispositions, the consequences of trafficking and being a pimp or being involved in this, they grew dramatically. Proposition 35 was huge for us. No one had used those laws, though. So we have to give a lot of credit to the people who started, both at Anaheim PD and the DA's office, who tested this out. And what we found was it was not hard to prosecute these people at all. And to the credit of the DA's office, they will conduct a preliminary hearing without their victims present. What you said is, there's very much truth in what you said, that our victims are generally completely uncooperative. Victims of human trafficking do not present themselves as what I would call an ordinary victim of a crime. So let me give you an example. When I was working in sexual assaults, it was very sad, because tragically 90% of my victims were all had been victimized while they were children, predominantly females, and all at the person, and really a person in position of trust, a family member. You're talking about a father, an uncle, a grandfather, a cousin, a brother. It was very tragic. But I remember when these girls would come in to tell their stories, they wanted me to believe them. They presented themselves as someone like, we're looking for someone to hear our story and believe us. And yes, we recognize that we're victims of a crime. Human trafficking victims are completely the opposite. They've been taught, do not trust law enforcement. We are the enemy. They will protect their pimps at all cost. They will lie as much as they can. So we have other methods of getting our evidence, and we've been extremely successful. At one point, the DA's office was boasting a 100% conviction rate. I don't know if it's still that high, but they were doing an amazing job. And between the investigators, they had a fantastic relationship with the DAs at the time, and we still do. And together, they were able to bring these cases to court. Now, I know there's other counties. It is true. There's other counties I won't mention who will not proceed without a victim, and that's in my opinion, it's injustice, because basically what you're saying is, if you can't find that victim, it's basically, no victim, no case mentality. It's a common phrase that is used, no victim, no case. And the pimps know this, so they will do everything they can to keep their victim, whether it's intimidation or putting them with a family member or threatening, to hurt their family members, anything to do to keep them from testifying. Fortunately, in Orange County, that's not the case. But you're right. In other parts of the state, they haven't made that commitment.
There's been changes. I mean, I started in police work in the early 80s and 90s, and it was mostly street prostitution. There were nights where you'd see dozens of people walking up and down the street. But with the advent of technology and changes, trafficking has changed. And it seems like a lot of this has gone online, and what we see on the streets is only a small portion of what is actually occurring.
100%. So there's three three places that we look for victims of human trafficking. The streets, okay, what you said back in the day, that's where we saw them. Online, and in brothels. Those are the three predominant places that, as an investigator, I know where my victims are. I know where to look, okay? I know where I can start an investigation if I needed to. I did see this stat on Polaris that in 2021, 65% of their victims were online. So that should tell you something. With the advent of the internet, for all the good that it's done, there's a lot of evil perpetrated, and technology has become an adversary for us. Nothing that we can't really work around. In some ways, we are able to use it as investigators to our benefit. And we can be clever about how we investigate these crimes. But you're absolutely right. Back in the day, you saw people on the street and they were right in front of you, and maybe you could use some investigative tools to identify not only victims but their traffickers. We got to work a little bit harder. But we've done a really good job. I know, speaking for the task force and other agencies that I know that are doing this kind of work, it's unfortunate what's happening on the internet, but the problem with the internet, it isn't so much, obviously it's the girls that are posting online, because there's so many websites out there right now that are primarily used to perpetrate prostitution and support it, okay? There's not a whole lot we can do about it. There's been efforts to do that. The FBI shut down Backpage during my tenure on the task force. All that resulted on that, and I'm not saying what they did was wrong. I was supportive of it for the most part. But all that happened afterwards was dozens of websites opened up, and a lot of them are based outside of the country. So as an investigator, trying to get information from those entities is very, very difficult. But the point I was going to make is, we know the girls are on there and we know the traffickers are on there, but the problem is traffickers are using every social media platform to target girls and to locate minors and to begin this what you called like an emotional motivation, where they're telling these girls, it all starts very innocuous. These are real life stories from my victims. How did you get into this? Well, I was on Instagram and I met this person. I went to his site. Next thing you know, they're conversing. This is our generation. This is how we communicate. Text back and forth, direct messages. One thing leads to another. The traffickers, giving compliments and commenting on their pictures on their Instagram. Next thing you know, they're meeting in person. And then that's generally where, the recruiting is starting. They've already selected their target. Now they're doing this recruiting. When they meet in person, they wine, they dine them, they take them out on a date. They show them things that they haven't done. Maybe they have intercourse, maybe they have sexual relationships. And then the next step is just the three-prong. It's like, okay, now we've got them to this level, and now we're going to, the ultimate goal, which is to exploit them. And this happens anywhere someone has a smartphone, that person is a potential victim.
That's really scary when you think that any potential victim, as long as they have access to the internet, could be victimized. I know one person who happens to be a police executive whose daughter met somebody on an internet site, and now she's being trafficked, but through an OnlyFans page.
Yes.
And something that he said she grew up playing sports, she went to good schools, she came from a loving family, but again, fell in love with her trafficker, who is now using her, to make money.
100%. It's super tragic. You can tell story after story that's just heartbreaking, but I think the message that I'd like to put out is, any parent that's listening to this, you have to be involved in your child, especially if you have a daughter. You have to be involved in their social media. We show a video. This is from way back when I started. The DAs had done an interview with a trafficker who admitted trafficker, and they did what's called a proffer. So let's just skip to the interview. The he was asked very, direct questions about his pimping behavior and who he targets. And they asked him a question, something along the line like, what advice would you give to people or parents? And his answer was something along the line like, I'm not trying to be funny, but if you have a daughter, you need to stay in their life. Because if you're not, I'm looking for them. I'm looking for someone who hasn't had that nurturing and that what we would consider, a somewhat healthy relationship with the father figure. And absent of that, every girl needs to be loved by their father. And this is not taking away anything from moms. Moms are fantastic. But what I'm telling you is if you have a daughter and you're not in their life and they are starving for attention, then I'm telling you that there's men out there, young men, older men, who are looking online for that one girl who wants to be told, you're beautiful, you're pretty, you're valuable, all the things a father should be telling his child. There's a whole study online. I'm not going to refer to it now, but your listeners can, if they're really interested, about the absence of a father figure in the home and how detrimental that is. I would say it's detrimental to everyone, but in particular, in my experience, to young girls. It makes them extremely vulnerable, and these are predators. If you think of them as, I would rather your audience think of them as predators instead of traffickers or pimps. Just think of them as a predator. They're out there looking, and they will exploit your loved one in a heartbeat without any remorse.
There are things that are being done, and there's been some recent laws that have come out to try to deal and basically make stiffer penalties for those who are trafficking to some degree of success or another. But while you also said we treat them as victims, we still have to set boundaries, because I've visited jurisdictions and have spoken with police chiefs and departments where there is this victim-centered approach, but one of the part of that was we're not going to prosecute any street prostitution anymore, and now it's out of control.
Right. No, I definitely have an opinion to that. All fantastic questions, of course. So I commend you on the questions. They're very thought-provoking and they're very relevant to the issue. So this is what I will say. As a task force, anytime our vice unit, you talk about the victim-centered approach, as a task, when I was on the task force, anytime our vice detail would go out and do a B sting, which means that we were going to be focusing on arresting girls for prostitution, we would always help them. Now, it seems counterintuitive, like, well, wait a minute, are they a victim or are they a suspect? Okay, well, the answer is they're both. They can be both. It depends on the given time and the situation. If they're out there committing a crime and working as a prostitute, they're committing a crime. I have personally, and a lot of my colleagues might differ with me on this, so this is just my opinion. Okay, you can choose to believe what you want. But like you said, if you ignore that, it's just going to perpetuate almost an acceptance of it. Okay?
You're almost enabling it to occur.
Almost enabling it to occur. And we'll get to legalizing prostitution maybe, but my opinions on that. But we would always be in favor of going out and supporting our vice unit. And we would arrest them. We would arrest the sex purchaser. But this is something that we changed, and what I would suggest to a lot of agencies that are going along this route. This is a conversation my supervisor and I had the last couple of years that I was in the detail, as we were really, more and more people were really struggling with this, because it is something that you need to talk about, discuss. Okay, we shouldn't be afraid to talk about it as adults. So what I suggested to my supervisor, let's do this. Let's support our vice unit or whatever team is out there doing these operations. But the difference is we're going to add a component here. Once we make those arrests for a misdemeanor, 647B of the Penal Code, and we get them to the holding facility, then what we're going to do is we're going to take the handcuffs off. We're going to bring them in another room, kind of like how we're sitting now. Members of our team are going to sit down with those girls and give them an opportunity. If they present themselves as victims, if we can get to the real story, because 90+% of the girls out there on the track, they have a pimp. I'm telling you that right now. You're just going to have to believe me on that. So in other words, when I'm interviewing this girl, I know she has a pimp, but how am I going to get this out of her? Well, we've already talked about that they're going to be uncooperative. But if there's a slight chance, we want to try. If she identifies as a victim, guess what? We're not going to arrest her. Or if we do, we're going to hold that. That doesn't mean she's convicted, right? And we're going to work with prosecutors to, if she's cooperative and we identify her as a victim, we're not going to get a twofer. Like on the opposite end, I've had agencies that we've trained, and I'll get a call from an investigator and go, hey, I arrested my first trafficker, it was great, and we arrested the girl, and I'm like, you can't do that. You don't get a twofer. Either she's a victim or a suspect. And once we identify her as a victim of human trafficking, I mean, there's laws that protect her. We have to now focus in on her care, her rehabilitation. Whether she's cooperative or not is irrelevant. We need to obey the law, and we need to do what's best for her, even if she's telling us we don't know what's best for her, you know. So I hopefully I answered your question there. I agree with you. I think that, again, it comes to ignorance. And when I say that word, I was ignorant for 21 years. I remember, Joe, when my training officer, I remember this as clear as day, drove me out to Beach Boulevard in Anaheim and pointed out all the girls working as prostitutes. And he said to me, that's a prostitute, that's a prostitute. And he asked me the question, what do we do with them? And I said, arrest them? And he said, absolutely. That I never was taught that they were a potential victim. So I was ignorant for 21 years of my career. I'm not ignorant anymore, okay? And while there's a lot of conversations going on and people thinking that it should be completely one or the other, I'm not taking a middle road to be, to not commit one way or the other. I'm saying that it's a case by case. We can't just throw a blanket statement and say, okay, well, if they're all victims, they're all victims. Or if they're all suspects, they're all suspects. How about we do it case by case? How about if we look at each individual person for who she is and try to get into finding out the truth about whether she's being exploited or not? I would much rather arrest someone for a felony crime of exploitation, pimping and pandering, human trafficking, than arrest a girl for a misdemeanor that she's going to receive a cite. She's going to go right back out into the street. She's going to be exploited some more after she gets a beat down from her pimp because she was arrested in the first place. That, to me, you got to look at what's the bigger thing you're doing for society. If you want to talk about true prevention and law enforcement, this is one thing that I'm really harping on in my training. We have the potential to prevent crime. If we arrest a trafficker and put him in prison, I don't care if it's 3 years or 30 years, think of all the girls that he is not exploiting. Think of all the girls, the daughters, the granddaughters, the nieces that you're protecting. And even if it's just a short amount of time. Now, we can't quantify that. It may not come up in our statistics. We may not be able to get up in front of a press conference and say, look at all the people we protected. But I believe 100%, and this is what drives my passion, is that if I can get one officer in my training, and I tell them this, if one of you just make one pimping arrest and put someone in prison, it's worth all of it. It's worth all the work. So
let's talk a little bit about what you're doing now.
Okay.
You're out. You've stressed, to myself, and you're passionate about the idea, training officers on the street how to respond to this. How does this enable, them to do a better job at what they're doing?
Well, first of all, we have to deal with the reality that, okay, so, I was searching the internet again before this interview, and depending on the stats of the day, if the stats are correct, there's 76,000 sworn law enforcement in California. We have the most sworn law enforcement of the nation. We have more law enforcement officers in our state than any other state in the nation, according to Mr. Google. 76,000. Now, when I was on the task force, all the training I did with the collaborative and that I was a part of, okay, over 8 years, before retirement, my boss and I sat down and I said, hey, how many law enforcement officers do you think we've trained over the 8 years? And we sat down there and we came up with a number of approximately 3,000. Now, 3,000, 76,000, Now, you have to think of over the 8 years, those 3,000 do not remain 3,000 because people leave the detail, they get promoted, they move to another, they move to another assignment. And of course, there's other agencies that are training. We weren't the only ones training. But my point is this: you can't not address human trafficking. And no matter what, the collaborative people that I work with, we've finally come to this consensus. Law enforcement is a point of the spear. There is no victim advocates. There is no social services. There is no care for HT victims, or very little of it if law enforcement is not identifying and arresting the perpetrators and identifying victims. Okay, so Polaris said that they had, hopefully I'm regurgitating these stats correctly, in 2021 they had over 16,000 reported incidents through the country. That's reported. So you can probably quadruple that or more of unreported. So think of all the victims of HT out there. Okay, it's a multi-billion-dollar business. $32 billion in the U.S. is contributed to commercialized sex trade. There's only one criminal element, and I know you're going to know the answer, so I'm not going to ask you. There's only one criminal element in the United States that tops that, and it's narcotics. And it's 33 billion. It's only 1 billion difference. Sorry, I'm getting a tangent for a second here. When people say that we're going to eliminate prostitution and we're going to eliminate human trafficking, I am not optimistic. I consider myself a realistic person. I'm a person of faith, okay? I read my Bible. Prostitution has been going on since the beginning of time. If you read Genesis, which is the first book of the Bible, for people that maybe don't read their Bible much, I'd encourage you to do that. The first book of the Bible, prostitution is discussed through the ages. It has been around since day one, and I hate to tell you, it's not going away. Because especially when there's $32 billion of assets coming in, it's kind of like, Joe, when we grow up in the generation of just say no to drugs. How did that work out for us? Mm-hmm. Here we are 20 years later. I don't think it's put a dent in what the cartel is doing or what trafficking business is going on. So sorry, I had to get on my soapbox for a second. I don't think it's realistic. So what can we do realistically to do? My passion is to train law enforcement, because out of those 16,000 reported calls, all of those calls go somewhere. So if you call the national hotline and you say, I think I have a victim of human trafficking, and let's say you give all wonderful information to the call taker. The call taker asks all the right questions. Now what does he or she do with that tip? They disseminate it to the agency that's responsible, or the jurisdiction where that victim comes to. Okay, so let's say the victim is in, we'll just use Anaheim. Okay, that's not a good example because we're going to do something about it. But let's say that tip lands in a jurisdiction that has absolutely no concept of human trafficking. They don't know the pimping and pandering laws. They've never been trained on it. Okay, and it falls on your desk and you read this and you say, I don't know what to do with this. This is completely new to me. Then all of those efforts that we put, and I'm not saying that awareness and education isn't good, but all the efforts that we put into that, if you don't have a law enforcement person trained on how to investigate these cases, in my opinion, it's for naught. It's for naught. And we're not. We have a moral, ethical, and legal obligation by law that says if we identify someone as an HT victim, we are compelled by the law to do something. Now, there's no one that follows up on that, but law enforcement has an amazing opportunity to do something about this. Okay, and it's not taking away from any of the collaborative and all the support groups out there, but even amongst my group of collaborative people, we've all come to agreement that law enforcement is the point of the spear. And if they're not trained, then in my opinion, we're just spinning our wheels. Or there's groups out there that just want the notoriety, they just want the press, that look at all the amazing things we're doing. One of the questions that you had put out to me before for me to review was, what kind of laws can we look forward to? What kind of laws and I'm going to tell you right now, we have fantastic laws in California. It's just nobody is aware of them. I didn't know that we had pimping and pandering laws. These laws came out in 2012 with Proposition 35. In 2014, I got selected to the trafficking unit. I never heard of 266HA pimping, 266I pandering, 236.1 human trafficking. Those laws are amazing. So we have the laws, but we don't have the people that are trained on how to investigate and enforce those laws. And to me, I find it's very tragic.
Well, we have to have the organizational will as departments to make it a priority, but we've also got to collectively, as a society, set a boundary and draw a line in the sand, per se. And when I hear the stories of the people that are victimized, it just reeks of tragedy.
Right.
And that at some point, collectively, we failed as a society, and people end up in this business, this line of work that is demeaning, it's dangerous and demoralizing, for the victims.
And it's a paradigm shift. I very much have a portion of my training where I'm talking to law enforcement officers. The first thing I ask them is, okay, who's the senior guy here and who's the junior guy here? I've had people in our trafficking in our trainings that have had 35 years on. All of this is new to them. It's a paradigm shift. It's kind of like programming a computer. It was like when my FTO told me this is how you are to view this particular element of society, of a girl that's working as a prostitute. She's nothing other than, excuse my language, a whore out there working, and she wants to work out there, so why should we care about them? That's how I was trained, okay? And that's not a criticism on my training. That's all we knew at the time. Well, we're better than that. And here we are in 2024 with these amazing laws at our availability. I know in Orange County, with prosecutors who are willing to fight for our and to back up our investigations. But it's a paradigm shift, and oftentimes it's the older officers like us. For me, I didn't know any better. I'm ignorant to it. And almost all my trainings, if I can, I will have a survivor come and speak. She will always steal the show, because our audience, especially the law enforcement officers, they get to hear from a real live person who has actually been victimized, and they get to hear the horrific stories of how they were treated. And for the first time in many of these law enforcement officers' career, they're looking at this girl who is labeled as a prostitute, and they're looking at her with fresh eyes. It's being unveiled before them, and they're like, oh my gosh, this is a human being. This is a human being. This is someone's daughter. This is someone's niece. This is a granddaughter, a loved one that has been exploited. And while there are elements that might be true, that it appears that they're having a good time and they're enjoying this lifestyle, I would submit to you that couldn't be farther from the truth. If you really, once you get to know and hear the stories, because everybody has a story. Here's the thing, Joe. I finally got smart, and it took me a long time to get smart. But in my investigation techniques, and I would talk to girls, and I started asking them the questions that were burning in my mind as I started to learn more about the culture. And then I started to ask the girls, what did you want to be when you grow up? I never, ever had one girl say, I wanted to sell my body. I wanted to sell the most intimate parts of my body to a total stranger 10 to 12 times a day, 7 days a week, even when I'm on my menstrual cycle, to lie in bed with them, to go to a filthy motel, to jump in the back seat of their car. I'll allow them to do whatever they wanted to do just so I could put money into a person's pocket. I can't think of a more horrific thing. And I've never had a girl say that. I've never had that this is what I wanted to be when I grow up. You get little girls that say, I want to be a princess. One of my girls said, I want to be a veterinarian. I want to be a probation officer. I want to be a social worker. I want to do cosmetics. I want to go to cosmetology school. I want to be a nurse. I want to be a police officer. None of the girls I've ever interviewed ever said that this is something that they would have chosen to do. So that's a myth.
Well, Happy, I truly appreciate your passion and the difference that you're making. I get it. I get the little girls playing with their Barbies and, wanting to be a princess or waiting for Prince Charming, and then life turns out to be a nightmare.
Right.
I appreciate you with being with us, and we'll definitely have to have you again, because I'd actually like to, for you to share some of the stories of the successes that you've had while you're in your time in the Orange County Human Trafficking Task Force.
I would love that.
Okay. Again, thank you for your time. I'm sure, hopefully, it's deeply appreciated and opens the eyes of a lot of people here. Thank you.
Thank you.